In 5 minutes, 3,000 warships ceased to exist, not destroyed, not defeated, but erased so completely that even their distress signals vanished mid-transmission, and long before that moment, long before humanity revealed what had become, the Galactic Council had already realized it was losing a war it could not understand, a war against an enemy that did not negotiate, did not retreat, and did not recognize the concept of mercy. And so in the vast chamber of the Council, where 47 species gathered under cold blue light, fear spread like a living thing, crawling to minds of beings who had once believed themselves untouchable, Ambassador Theorick stood at the center, his insect-like frame rigid as he delivered the words no one wanted to hear, that the Vrex Collective had broken to the Kepler Gate defenses, that entire fleets had been reduced to debris fields in minutes, that 80% of their forces were gone, and that the enemy was no longer at the borders but moving steadily toward the heart of civilized space. And as murmurs of panic filled the chamber, as chemical signals of distress mixed with whispered calculations of extinction timelines, one truth became impossible to ignore. Nothing they'd built, nothing they believed in, could stop what was coming, because the Vrex did not fight like them. They did not follow rules or honor or restraint. They consumed, adapted, and annihilated, leaving behind only silence. And for 3 years the Council had thrown everything it had at them: elegant warships designed for precision combat, advanced energy weapons tuned for efficiency, defensive systems built on centuries of ethical constraints, and every single time they had failed, their fleets collapsing under overwhelming force, their tactics outmatched by something far more brutal and far more efficient, until finally, when the question of options was asked, the answer that came back was none. Nothing left, nothing, except one possibility so dangerous that even speaking aloud fractured the fragile unity of the Council, because there was one species they had not called upon, one civilization they had deliberately excluded, isolated, and quietly hoped will remain irrelevant forever: humanity, a name that carried with it 2 centuries of judgment and unease, a species once described as violent, unpredictable, incapable of coexistence, a species that had been offered membership in the galactic community, and had instead been pushed away after demonstrating a level of aggression that unsettled even the most war-hardened races. And yet now, as the Vrex threat loomed closer with every passing cycle, the idea that had once been unthinkable became the only remaining path forward, not because anyone trusted humanity, but because desperation had stripped away the luxury of caution. And so the debate erupted, voices clashing, accusations rising, memories of past encounters resurfacing, stories of human brutality and efficiency retold with renewed fear, until finally a vote was forced, and by the narrowest margin, the decision was made to reach out to the one species the galaxy feared almost as much as the enemy itself. And weeks later, as a lone diplomatic vessel approached the outer boundary of human-controlled space, Ambassador Theorick felt something he had not felt even in the face of the Vrex: uncertainty, because the stories about humanity were contradictory. They spoke of isolation and silence, but also of relentless progress, of weapons that violated established doctrines, of technologies that blurred the line between possibility and impossibility. And as his ship transmitted the identification codes and waited, the response came instantly, precise, controlled, and unmistakably human, granting permission to proceed, but with a warning that carried no ambiguity: deviate from the designated path and be destroyed. And as the escort ships arrived, sleek and unervingly precise in their movements, Theorick began to understand that the rumors had not been exaggerated, because everything he saw as they traveled deeper into the system spoke of preparation, not for exploration or diplomacy, but for war. Massive orbital platforms armed with weapons larger than most Council ships, fleets positioned in layered defensive formations, patrol patterns executed with machine-like perfection, and at the center of it all, a space station orbiting Mars, immense, functional, devoid of ornamentation, a structure built with a single purpose in mind: efficiency. And as he was escorted through its corridors, surrounded by humans in uniform who watched him with a mixture of curiosity and cold calculation, he felt the weight of the Council's past decisions pressing down on him. Because this was not a species that stagnated in isolation. This was a species that had evolved, adapted, and refined itself in ways the Council had never anticipated. And when he finally stood before Admiral Sarakowski, he was not facing a desperate civilization eager to rejoin the galaxy. He was facing something far more unsettling: a power that had no need for approval, no desire for validation, only its own objectives and its own rules. And as the conversation unfolded, as he explained the threat, the scale of destruction, the inevitability of the Vrex reaching human space, eventually he realized that convincing humanity to help would not be a matter of diplomacy or persuasion. It would be a matter of alignment, because humanity would not act out of sympathy or obligation, only out of calculated necessity. And when the Admiral finally agreed, not out of desperation but out of cold strategic logic, setting conditions that stripped away every ethical limitation the Council had built over centuries, one thing became clear. The galaxy was not just asking for help, it was unleashing something it did not fully understand. And as the human fleet prepared to deploy, 50 ships chosen from a much larger force, each one built not as a symbol of power but as an instrument of it, Ambassador Theorick felt a shift deep within himself, a realization that the coming battle would not just determine the fate of billions. It would redefine the balance of power in the galaxy forever, because if humanity succeeded where everyone else had failed, then the greatest threat to galactic stability would no longer be the Vrex, but the very species now being called upon to stop them. And somewhere far beyond the edges of known space, the Vrex Collective continued its advance, unaware that for the first time since their conquest began, they were about to encounter something that did not simply resist, but understood war on the same fundamental level, and were prepared to take it further than anyone had ever dared. The moment the human fleet entered Council space, something felt wrong to every observer watching from the command decks of 100 different species, not because of their numbers, which were laughably small compared to the massive armadas assembled to face the Vrex, but because of the way they moved, perfectly synchronized, mathematically precise. 50 ships emerging from faster-than-light travel, not as a scattered group, but as a single unified structure, each vessel holding formation with such exactness that it seemed less like a fleet and more like a single organism. And as sensors locked onto them, the discomfort only deepened, because nothing about these ships matched what the Council understood about war. Their hulls were angular and brutal, layered with dense armor plating that sacrificed elegance for raw survivability. Their weapon mounts were oversized, disproportionately so, as if designed without any concern for balance or efficiency, only for maximum destructive output. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the complete absence of anything unnecessary, no decorative elements, no symbolic markings, no artistic identity, just function, pure and unapologetic. And as the fleet slowed to a control halt within the staging area, every officer watching realized the same thing at once. These were not ships designed by a civilization that viewed war as a last resort. These were ships built by a species that had studied war, lived through it, and ultimately mastered it. And when Admiral Sarakowski's image appeared across the command network, her voice calm and steady as she requested tactical data, the contrast between her composed tone and the growing unease in the Council Command Center became impossible to ignore, because while they saw an overwhelming enemy force approaching, she saw a problem to be solved and nothing more. And as data streams were exchanged, as projections of the Vrex fleet appeared in layered holographic displays showing thousands of hostile vessels converging on Proxima Secundus, the scale of the impending battle became clear. Nearly 3,000 Vrex ships forming a dense perimeter around the planet, their bombardment already underway, their weapons systematically erasing cities from existence, millions of lives extinguished every minute. And against that, the combined Council forces, barely 200 ships, already taking losses, already retreating under pressure. And yet the human fleet did not hesitate, did not reposition, did not attempt to coordinate with the Council's defensive formations. Instead, they accelerated, engines burning at outputs that exceeded what most species considered structurally safe, closing the distance at a velocity that bordered on reckless. And for a brief moment, confusion rippled through both allied and enemy senses alike, because this was not how battles were fought. This was not strategy. It was aggression distilled to its purest form, and inside the bridge of the EDS. Prometheus. Admiral Sarakowski stood at the center of controlled chaos, her crew moving with absolute precision, each officer executing their role without hesitation, years of training evident in every action. And as the range of the target decreased, as enemy weapon systems began to pivot toward the approaching human fleet, she gave the order that would redefine the battle, all weapons free. And what followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration, The first volley fired, not with energy beams or plasma, but with kinetic force. Railguns unleashing projectiles accelerated to near light speed, tungsten rods that crossed millions of kilometers in fractions of a second. And when they struck, the effect was immediate and absolute. Vrex ships did not explode. They did not fracture. They simply vanished. The energy of the impact converting matter into plasma so rapidly that nothing recognizable remained. Entire vessels erased before their crews could even register the attack. And in the second that followed, before the Vrex could adjust, before their command structure could process the unprecedented damage, the second phase began. Antimatter torpedoes launched in coordinated waves, each one a contained annihilation event waiting to be triggered. And as they penetrated the dense formations of the Vrex fleet, their detonation transformed sections of space into blinding spheres of energy, matter and antimatter, reacting with total efficiency, releasing destructive force that overwhelmed shields, vaporized hulls, and sent shockwaves of radiation cascading through nearby ships, multiplying devastation with every chain reaction. And then came the drones, tens of thousands of autonomous units deploying simultaneously, moving with a level of coordination that no organic crew could replicate, their artificial intelligence linking them into a distributed combat network, each unit acting independently yet in perfect harmony with the whole, adapting in real time to enemy defenses, exploiting weaknesses, overwhelming point defense systems through sheer speed and numbers, and as they swarmed the Vrex fleet, weaving between larger vessels, targeting critical systems, sacrificing themselves in precise kamikaze strikes. The scale of destruction accelerated beyond anything the Council had ever witnessed, and within minutes, what had been a dominant force of 3,000 ships began to collapse into chaos, formations breaking, apart, command signals disrupted, entire squadrons wiped out before they could even return fire effectively. And from the perspective of Fleet Commander Vormik, watching from the heart of the Vrex formation, the realization came too late. This was not an opponent bound by the same limitations, not a species constrained by rules or ethics, but something far more dangerous, a mirror, an enemy that understood brutality, efficiency, and absolute commitment to victory in a way that even the Vrex had not anticipated. And as he ordered a retreat, as surviving ships attempted to disengage, to escape the rapidly shrinking battlefield, the human fleet did not pursue in desperation. They advanced with calculated precision, eliminating targets methodically, ensuring that every opportunity to inflict damage was maximized. And when it was over, when the last major resistance collapsed and the remnants of the Vrex fleet fled into faster-than-light retreat, the silence that followed was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it, because in less than 6 minutes, an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for years had been reduced to scattered debris and fleeing survivors, and the human fleet, all 50 ships, remain intact, shields holding, systems operational, casualties non-existent. And as the Council forces finally arrived, their ships slowing as they entered the battlefield, their sensors scanning the aftermath, what they saw defied comprehension. A debris field stretching across millions of kilometers, fragments of what had once been a massive armada, and at its center, the human fleet, holding position in perfect formation, as if waiting, not celebrating, not retreating, simply waiting for the next command. And in that moment, across every channel, every sensor feed, every observation deck, a single realization spread to the minds of those who witnessed it. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, not gradually, not subtly, but in an instant, and the species they had once feared for their unpredictability had just demonstrated something far more unsettling, not chaos, but control, complete and absolute control over our war. And as transmissions began flooding in, requests for data, demands for explanations, attempts to understand what just happened, Admiral Sarakowski gave a simple order: ignore them. Because from her perspective, the battle had never been about proving anything to the Council. It had been about achieving the objective, stopping the Vrex, saving the planet. And now that it was done, the implications could wait, but elsewhere, far from the battlefield, deep within Vrex territory, those implications were already taking shape as the surviving commander delivered his report to the Supreme Collective, describing an enemy unlike any they had faced, an enemy that fought not just with strength but with precision, not just with numbers but with overwhelming efficiency. And as the collective processed the data, analyzing the battle in moments. Their response was not fear, but adaptation, a shift in strategy that would escalate the conflict beyond anything the galaxy had yet seen. Because if 50 ships could do this, then the next encounter would not be fought with thousands, but with tens of thousands, and the war that had once seemed unwinnable for the Council was about to become something far more dangerous, a clash between two forces that both understood one fundamental truth. Victory was not about survival. It was about total dominance, and neither side intended to lose. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the battle itself, a suffocating stillness that spread across every Council channel, every command deck, every world that had witnessed the impossible, because what they had just seen was not victory. It was something far more unsettling, a demonstration of power so absolute that it shattered everything they believed about war. And as a human fleet held position in the debris field, perfectly aligned, untouched, and eerily calm, the officers of the Galactic Council struggled to process a reality where 3,000 warships could be erased in less time than it took to prepare a conventional assault. And at the center of that disbelief stood Ambassador Theorick, his body trembling, not from fear of the Vrex anymore, but from the realization that the species they had once dismissed had just redefined the rules of existence itself. And when Admiral Sarakowski's image appeared across the command network, once more, her voice, steady, almost indifferent as she confirmed the elimination of the Vrex fleet and the safety of the planet, her words carried a weight that went far beyond the report itself, because there was no triumph in her tone, no celebration, only the calm efficiency of a task completed. And that, more than anything, unsettled the Council, because it meant that what they had witnessed was not humanity at its limit. It was humanity operating well within it. And as the first wave of transmissions flooded, in questions, demands, desperate attempts to understand the mechanics behind such overwhelming force, Sarakowski's response was measured and controlled, offering nothing beyond the simplest explanation, that they had engaged the enemy using standard human doctrine, that their weapons had performed as designed, that the outcome was expected. And those words echoed to the Council like a quiet warning, because if this was standard, then the gap between humanity and the rest of the galaxy was not just large, it was unbridgeable. And as Chancellor Morvax attempted to maintain diplomatic balance, thanking humanity for their assistance while carefully probing for answers, the tension in the exchange revealed a deeper truth. The Council was no longer dealing with a potential member or even an ally, but with an independent power whose capabilities demanded respect whether it was given willingly or not. And when Sarakowski made it clear that humanity would not share its technology, that its systems were classified and would remain so, the unspoken message became impossible to ignore. Humanity had no intention of allowing the galaxy to catch up. And in that moment, across dozens of species and countless observers, a new kind of fear began to take shape. Not the immediate terror of annihilation, but the slow, creeping realization that the balance of power had shifted permanently, and that there was now a force in the galaxy that could not be controlled, negotiated with on equal terms, or even fully understood. And as Ambassador Theorick made the decision to board the human flagship once again, seeking to bridge the widening gap between the Council and this emerging power, he did so knowing that the conversation he was about to have might determine the future of the entire galaxy, because the question was no longer whether humanity would help, but what humanity would do next. And inside the sterile, efficient corridors of the Prometheus, where every system hummed with controlled power and every human moved with purpose, he was reminded once again that this was not a civilization seeking validation. It was one that had already defined itself. And when he stood before Sarakowski, attempting to explain the political storm that was already forming across Council space, the divisions that were emerging between those who saw humanity as a necessary ally and those who now viewed it as the greatest threat they had ever faced, the response he received was both expected and deeply unsettling, because Sarakowski did not deny the concerns. She acknowledged them, accepted them as inevitable, and made it clear that humanity's priorities would not change to accommodate the fears of others, that they would continue to act in their own interest, to protect their own space, and to engage threats only when those threats intersected with their own strategic goals. And yet, despite that cold pragmatism, there was a line she drew with clarity. Humanity was not seeking conquest, not seeking to dominate the galaxy, only to ensure that no force, whether Vrex or otherwise, would ever pose a threat to Earth again. And that distinction, subtle as it was, became the foundation of the fragile understanding that began to form between them, because while humanity might not be a traditional ally, it was not an immediate enemy either, and as Theorick pushed further, seeking some gesture that could ease the growing tension, some indication that humanity was willing to coexist rather than simply exist alongside others, Sarakowski offered a compromise, limited intelligence sharing, enough to help Council forces improve their defenses against the Vrex, but nothing that would compromise human technological superiority, and it was a small concession, but in the context of what just happened, it was enough to begin shifting the narrative to give those within the Council who supported cooperation something to hold on to, even as others prepared for a future where humanity might one day stand opposed to them, and beyond the immediate aftermath, beyond the political maneuvering and diplomatic exchanges, the true consequence of the battle was already unfolding in the shadows, deep within Vrex territory, where the Supreme Collective processed the data of their defeat with cold, calculating precision, because unlike the Council, the Vrex did not react with fear or confusion. They reacted with adaptation, analyzing every detail, every weapon signature, every tactical decision, identifying patterns, weaknesses, possibilities, and when their conclusion was reached, it was both simple and terrifying. The humans were not just another enemy. They were a direct threat to Vrex supremacy, a force that could not be ignored, could not be allowed to grow unchecked. And so the order was given not for retaliation, not for a limited counterattack, but for total mobilization. Every warship, every resource, every strategic asset redirected toward a single objective, the destruction of humanity. And as that command rippled through Vrex space, fleets began to assemble on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. Tens of thousands of warships converging, supply lines stretching across entire systems. Commanders preparing for a war that would not be fought for territory or resources, but for survival itself. And as this massive force began its slow, inevitable movement toward Council space, the contrast between the two sides became starkly clear. On one side, a species that had perfected war through centuries of internal conflict, now unified and focused, and on the other, a collective empire that had built its identity on conquest and adaptation, now facing an opponent that mirrored its own strengths while surpassing its expectations. And in space between them, caught in the middle, was a Galactic Council struggling to adapt to a reality where the outcome of the war no longer depended on their actions, but on the collision of two forces far beyond their control. And as news of the battle spread across the galaxy, carried by transmissions and whispered through diplomatic channels, the narrative began to shift. Humanity was no longer the isolated species at the edge of known space. It was now a central player in the most significant conflict of the era, a force that could not be ignored. And as different civilizations reacted in their own ways, some seeking alliances, others preparing defenses, all of them watching closely, one question echoed louder than any other. What would happen when the Vrex returned, not with 3,000 ships, but with 30,000, and whether the same overwhelming dominance would hold, or whether the balance would tip in a way that no one could predict. And as the human fleet remained in position, awaiting further orders, the calm before the storm settled over the battlefield, because everyone, from the highest council chambers to the deepest reaches of Vrex territory, understood one thing with absolute certainty. The war had changed. It was no longer a fight for survival against a single enemy. It was now a test of supremacy between two powers that both believed they could not be defeated. And when they clashed again, the outcome would not just determine who won the war, it would define the future of the galaxy itself. Because if humanity proved capable of defeating even this overwhelming force, then the question would no longer be whether they could be stopped, but whether anyone would ever dare to try. And if they failed, if even their perfected machines and ruthless strategies were not enough, then the Vrex would emerge not just victorious, but unstoppable, and the galaxy, for all its diversity, all its history, all its civilizations, will become nothing more than another memory consumed by an empire that had finally met its match and crushed it. And somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars, two forces moved closer to each other, one driven by calculated purpose, the other by relentless domination. And when they met again, there would be no hesitation, no restraint, no second chances. Only war, absolute and unforgiving. The kind of war that civilizations are built to avoid, but which some, like humanity, are built to win.